Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and back with another Final Fantasy 16 interview roundup. Sorry it took me more than an hour to get this one out, but after the last several and my live stream, plus all the things I had to do today that weren't work on videos, just been a little bit tired. So, gonna release this in the morning after I get it recorded, because it's already getting kinda late when I'm recording this one. Now, in the previous ones, I mentioned that I wanted to combine some interviews into one video, because some of them weren't as substantial compared to other interviews that were released. And so this video is actually going to be 3 different interviews that each have a couple of details here that are fairly interesting, especially the last one we're going to be going over. This first one is from the PlayStation blog, and quite frankly, this was the first one I think any of us really saw. It was accidentally posted early on the Japanese PlayStation blog and was taken down in less than 60 seconds, but it was basically a heads up letting us know that a ton of interviews were about to drop. Now, this one largely goes into things that, again, the other interviews have kind of beaten into a pulp. Of course, saying you've likely poured over every text, screenshot, and trailer since the game was originally announced, and I totally feel them on that, because that is definitely what I have been doing. So, PlayStation blog, they say they quizzed Yoshida to pull back the curtain on the game's development. You get his personal perspective, among other things, answering the call to create the latest mainline Final Fantasy title, developing for the PlayStation 5, of course, it's the PlayStation blog, and his favorite summon. So as you can tell from the contents, even just in that little synopsis, that's why this one's kind of being combined with some of the other ones. The first question is, what do you think are the core tenets of the Final Fantasy game? The development team looked in the past titles in the series for guidance or inspiration when building 16. Now, they do have an answer here that's not as, I guess, separative as the previous answer we got regarding to this, where he said he doesn't really compare to any of the previous ones, but he said that the elements they looked for were deep story, deep gameplay, cutting-edge graphics, and cutting-edge sound, as well as chocobos and moogles. Now, the big thing here is in the 35 history of the Final Fantasy series, it's always been the guiding policy that each new installment has to be the very best that the director at the time can put together. This is actually something we heard him say that Kitase-san himself specifically gave him as a piece of advice when he heard he was taking on a mainline title. No matter how the game world, the characters, or battle system might change. Because of this, gamers and Final Fantasy fans around the world have very different ideas on what a Final Fantasy game should be, but to me, it's those elements. I feel like did I release that video? I was going to do a video about what Final Fantasy is to me, and it was actually kind of going over this exact prospect. You know, Final Fantasy fans are always so rabid with each other, depending on what we like or don't like, or accept that other people like, or don't accept that other people don't like. And, I mean, hits the nail on the head with that one. But to him, that's what they are, and so those are some of the guiding principles. So when it came to talking about Final Fantasy 16, you know, he goes over this whole cinematic approach where he felt like he was playing the lead in a movie. This is something he's repeated in several interviews, which again, why we're kind of skipping around. These are just statements that we've heard before. Thinking back to the beginning of the 16 project, do you remember how the conversation went when you were asked to produce the new mainline entry? What was your initial reaction? He said this is, again, something he's gone over in the other one, so we can kind of skip around. But basically, he said, I have Final Fantasy 14. I'm honored you chose me, but I don't want to be a director. So as long as I don't have to direct the game, it'll be okay. Because otherwise, I would probably have to divert my attention too much between the games, and it's going to hurt both games in the end. And I completely agree with that. To ensure, yeah, we picked out a very small group of core team members to start with. He actually goes over those team members in another interview. Basically, 4 people who began outlining it back in 2015. And then they gradually built the team up over time before eventually rolling into a full production way later down the line. Yeah, since Heavensward released, they were at least somewhat considering that. Before Final Fantasy 15 even released, quite frankly, how it should be when you have a franchise like this, the next entry should be considered probably before the previous entry is even finished, and we can definitely see that with the earlier era of Final Fantasy games and the frequency with which they released. Now, how is the composition for the rest of 16's development team decided? Being the director of a Final Fantasy game is tougher job than most people imagine. Not only do you have the expectations of the fans and the media to live up to, you're constantly under pressure from the development team too. You always have to be up for the challenge. Now he goes into why he chose certain people. Hiroshi Takai was the first person he went to. We have met him via the live streams that they've done, the anniversary events, fan fest, etc., etc. But he's been, creeping into the back a little bit, and that's because he's been working on this. It's someone he trusts in. When he asked him to take on the role, he said yes. Then they brought in the story writer, and I forgot, they named one other person in the other interview. But once they had those 4 people and they worked things out, eventually it moved into full-scale development, but it was quite some time. All he said was this just can't impact Final Fantasy XIV, and it's a good thing he had that train of thought, because we would have definitely noticed. Even now, when people don't like something or they feel like there's been an oversight, they blame Final Fantasy 16. So I get why he feels that pressure in his mind of, oh man, we can't screw this up. And that's fine. Let's see. Then this is just talking about, this next question is talking specifically about the story writing process. How has it felt switching from multi-year, multi-expansion arc to a self-contained standalone story? And he says, honestly, so first of all, Yoshida has worked on non-MMOs before. He worked on the second Bomberman 64 game, one of my favorites from back on the N64 era, but also just says that Final Fantasy XIV has a lot of story. So the only major difference he noticed was that if he wanted to foreshadow something, it had to pay off by the end of the game. Not trying to set up the sequel, I see. Not trying to set up Final Fantasy 16-2 and the audio drama in the book. Glad to see that. Does the logo have any secret meaning? And he says, yes, but I'm not going to tell you that. Probably a good idea. We have a release window. What will the development team be focusing on in the final year? They've already answered this before. It's already fully playable. There's some voiceover work that needs to be done. They need to playtest a few more things, the different difficulty levels, put final touches on the cutscenes, and go through a full-scale debugging process. A year is a short time in game development, so we're straining at the bit to get this over the line. In other words, don't be surprised if it's fall 2023. I mean, it happens. It's happened a lot the past couple of years, to no one's surprise. It's now been confirmed that some 14 dev members are working on 16. Do you have specific systems or processes in place to ensure the team can perform to the best of their abilities across two tonally distinct games without burning themselves or yourself out? Imagine lots of work on 16 must have been happening around the same time 14 and Walker preparations were happening. I wouldn't call it a system, but project managers and assistant producers on both projects do a great job of planning out my schedule to make sure I'm not overwhelmed. Good. He lets other people handle that, because if he did it himself, he would just try to do everything himself. We've seen that before with Yoshi-P. Any decisions regarding overall management, he leaves in the hand of upper management. He's really trying to just fill the role of producer and nothing more. So that's all there is to that. And Soken has his own people in the sound department that help him with his schedule, so he won't speak on his behalf. What is your favorite summon in Final Fantasy? And what's your favorite summon in 16? For Final Fantasy, he says it's Bahamut. He's a big part of the story in Final Fantasy 14 also. But for 16, he won't say, because it's a bit of a spoiler. So he doesn't want to say anything. Excuse me, video. You're slowing down my video. Soken, why did you choose Soken? What insight do you have on the trailer's music? Was it made just for this beat, or does it include themes and lay motifs we can expect to hear? And we get a very, you can tell he's worked with Soken a while answer. He's like, Soken's the kind of composer who likes to repurpose parts for the in-game soundtrack and trailers. Basically, Soken really likes to do motifs and themes. It's something he does fantastically, and sometimes he even does it in ways that you barely notice until you really stop and think about it. So you'll have to invite Soken for an interview to get more information, but only once he's finished working on the soundtrack. Keeping the business in line. And of course, the final line here, what are some opportunities afforded by the PlayStation 5 hardware? It's a PlayStation block. Like, of course it had to happen. But it does actually raise an interesting point. The boost in processing power is one thing, but the super fast load times are the big thing. So I really wonder, so Yoshi-P's been really touting about how the game will feel seamless when you're going from cutscene to battle, etc., etc. And I wonder how that looks when we have worse load times. Because when it eventually comes out for PC, we know it will at some point. Come on. There are going to be people that aren't rocking the latest hardware, but, you know, I guess maybe by then more people, it'll be like a really standard thing for people to be running games on SSDs. There's always going to be the chance that there's someone that isn't. So I wonder what it ends up looking like for the game if it's not on a super fast load time piece of hardware. So really curious to see how that pans out. So that's interview number 1. We read through the points a little bit more slowly than I had intended, but the next one is from the Washington Post, whose ads are right in the middle of the video, because of course they are. Now, the title is a little bit stretched, but the text below is a little bit more accurate. The man who saved Final Fantasy is forging its future. I mean, yeah, it's 14. He saved 14, and that was a pretty important thing, so I think that's a fair enough distinction to make. So this one doesn't have any like question or answer. It's really just written out as an article with no, like, you have to read the whole thing kind of through and through. So I'm definitely going to skip through this one a little bit faster. It starts with the usual PR stuff, talking about the history of Final Fantasy, turn-based combat, fantastical worlds, quirky characters, and then talks about 16's unveiling, you know, showed familiar summons that had become icons for the franchise. Haha, good joke. Showed a little else. I felt that players were about to enter a Final Fantasy game. The slower, more methodical turn-based combat system is gone in favor of something that looks ripped straight from Devil May Cry. That is fitting. I just had an alert pop up on my computer, and it scared the crap out of me if you saw me jump. The fantastical setting is gone, too, in favor of a more realistic medieval setting with dark undertones akin to a Souls game. So I'm going to say this right now. I apologize, person who wrote this. Articles, it's not uncommon for us when we're doing criticisms or interviews or anything gaming related news. I think we all feel really comfortable relating something that we know to something else that we know. But I gotta admit, this is kind of hard to read. It won't let it stand on any of its own merits. It has to be something ripped straight from another game or dark undertones akin to a Souls game. It's like both of these, you could have just said it's action-oriented gameplay akin to other popular, like, I don't know. It's just very sloppy writing to me. Kind of amateurish writing. So it's kind of weird to read that in the Washington Post. So I guess actually it's not that weird, but whatever. Producer brought on the salvage developer. Square Enix's critically panned venture into the MMORPG. Listen, the writer is very real. They're very dim. Like, in terms of, like, their demeanor. Like, everything kind of has this, like, sad, depressing undertone when I'm reading it. I haven't read this, like, through word for word before now. Potentially, Yoshi-P is credited, who's cited for not just saving 14, but potentially the entire franchise. Oh, hello, Meet Michael. That's his name. It's Meet Michael, not Michael, I swear. When you're thinking about the future of the Final Fantasy franchise, you have to aim for that generation of players that have never touched Final Fantasy before, said in an interview with the Washington Post. Maybe they think the series is too old, too classic, so you create something that shows them this could be an exciting game. Yeah, Yoshi just mentioned how he's not trying to hang on to legacy here so much as just embodying elements of Final Fantasy, but making sure it's something that will continue the franchise and not just kind of stagnate it, which seems to be what a lot of people want, or at least very loud people want. I don't want you to think I'm abandoning those veteran players and fans of the series, because we're definitely not. We want to create something that everyone feels is epic. Hey, I'm on board. Listen, you're hitting a lot of notes that I like. I got to play it first to know if I like it, but so far you're hitting a lot of notes that I like. Square Enix has been struggling with an identity crisis with the series for more than a decade. A tumultuous production cycle plagued 2006's Final Fantasy XII. Plagued it, it certainly affected it. I don't know how much it plagued it, considering how Final Fantasy XII turned out. Eventually, how Zodiac Age turned out as well, or ICJS. Final Fantasy XIII's pivot to more action-based combat system polarized fans. Yeah, that's fair. And Final Fantasy 15 was straight even further, featured a convoluted narrative that unfolded across several DLCs, a spin-off. I forgot about the beat-em-up anime miniseries and a movie. I forgot about the beat-em-up. Oh, there's also there's like 2 other mobile games too. Forgot those. When Final Fantasy 14 initially released in 2010, it was heavily... See, that's the thing. We're just reading about, like, the Final Fantasy franchise. This is barely even talking about things for Final Fantasy 16. He's taken away... lessons he's taken away from 14 into 16's design philosophy. Combat system of 16 is a prime example of this. It's action-oriented, emphasizing flashy combos and read and react combat that the Final Fantasy series has been trending towards since 12. Does 12 really read and react? Would I really consider it that? I personally wouldn't. But attempts to incorporate elements longtime fans will recognize. It won't be a solo experience, contrary to how it appears in the trailer. We've heard this in the other interviews. While Clive will be the character you play, you will have AI-controlled party members who will banter and connect through the game, similar to past Final Fantasy games. He also teases you'll have a faithful buddy. For those who haven't been keeping up, that's Torgal. He is the dog from the original Awakening trailer. We can assume he will grow up and be an important ally to Clive in his later years. While specific details of the combat will be revealed at a later date, he's confident in the direction the system is taking. At least at Square Enix now with titles like 15, 7 Remake, and Kingdom Hearts series under its belt, finally has expertise to create a compelling action combat system. I will say this, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, I'm a big fan of when it comes to the action combat. 3, I felt like they tried to do too much, but when you strip away some of the more tedious elements of 3, you actually still get a really solid action game. It's just a matter of the fact that you have to erase certain aspects of the game and simplify it to make it more engaging and not less engaging. That was really the drawback of Kingdom Hearts 3 for me. The Kingdom Hearts team at Square Enix has been especially helpful in contributing to the real-time combat and boss battles, Yoshida said. It can be said that battles in 16 are in some ways a culmination of the company's past experiences. I think that's fair. I mean, Kingdom Hearts 2 to this day is one of the most beloved action RPGs of all time. And I think that's for good reason, given how the combat flows. Yes, the QTEs get a little excessive at times, but I think we've all, at some point, really taken the time to appreciate a no-damage, no-hit run of Kingdom Hearts, at whether it be a GDQ or just casually on YouTube when the final mix for Kingdom Hearts 2 first came out. Those are good times. There's a lot of positive memories around that. Now, I really like this next thing. The team, led by battle director Ryota Suzuki, formerly of Capcom, who's helped design Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Devil May Cry 5, and Dragon's Dogma. Yeah, I'm a fan. I'm a fan, all right. Feels similarly confident, according to Yoshida. Issues that plagued previous games in the franchise around battle animations, combat fluidity, and messy UIs have all been streamlined thanks to Suzuki's guidance. Now, I will say on the messy UIs part, 16's UI in the latest trailer, little over busy. Maybe it's just the font size on some things. I think if maybe it didn't have every single event that you did, every single special condition you met popping up in giant font, they just shrink that down, probably get something a little bit more concise. But glad to see they're admitting that these things have been a problem and that they've done better. I feel like 7 handled it really well also, and they've just gotten better about it overall. Yoshi also believes the game's story, which this is not going to be a happy tale, includes a setting, Valencia, that is much darker and will have overarching themes reminiscent of what fans in the series have come to expect, which I am very much looking forward to. It talks about how it's a game about ideals. We've heard that in the other interviews. And then also just reiterating Final Fantasy 15's startup screen says a Final Fantasy game for fans and first-timers, and he thinks 16 will continue in that vein. He thinks that all games should be like that. You should be able to pick up a game and play it, whether you're a first-time player or somebody who's been playing them for decades, you know. Foundation for Final Fantasy 16 is to build something that's going to be enjoyable for veteran fans as well as new players. Okay, it started off kind of as a weak article, but it has some really, really solid points towards the end to highlight. Now, the last one, I was originally going to do a standalone video on this one because it's quite juicy, but again, most of the things actually end up being kind of retreadings of interviews that we've already covered. And again, starts with the usual PR stuff, talking about the recent Dominance trailer, the Eikons, how they're going to be playing into the story. We also have, of course, the critically acclaimed expansions for Final Fantasy 14 when talking about Yoshida's prior successes. And they also whipped up a couple of separate pieces for this. This is actually like the 4th one when I scrolled down, but instead we have just the original source one. Now, the first question goes over the Eikons again. How did Eikons become such a big part of the world? And stuff that we've heard like in 3 or 4 different interviews. They're like nuclear bombs. Each nation has one. A single individual awakens them, called a dominant. And then that person can summon forth their power by literally changing into the Eikon. Instead of having a summoner job, you become the Eikon itself. Talks about the mother crystals and how they're weakening. So now the nations are warring against each other in order to take control of the other mother crystals. This is all stuff that we've already gone over in other interviews. The only reason they decided to make it a game that revolved around the summons is they thought it would both be unique and exciting to have a game where the players could actually control them, speaking of the Eikon battles that they've mentioned many times before. Now, this is about why they're going to a more darker and more classic Final Fantasy theme rather than, wow, you can tell it's getting late for me, the more modern or steampunk styles. And the answer is summed up pretty well here. They did a round of user research and found that players are starting to notice the style was becoming stagnant, where there was this constant, almost like near equal balance of high fantasy elements and sci-fi with classic medieval stuff like swords and magic. So they wanted to go something that was a more classic medieval fantasy style. They said it was something that they wanted to do not just for the fans, but as developers, so they can do something different than what's been done in recent years. The other reason is that the development team, himself included, just enjoy that style the best. So they wanted to make a game in that style. Now, the combat section has a couple of interesting notes here. Now, the first couple of bits here just talk about the history of Final Fantasy's gameplay. Again, talking about how everyone has a different idea of what makes Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. But they really want to show developers of the future generations of Final Fantasy games that you don't have to stick to exactly the same thing that's already been done. You can take on kinds of challenges, make a new game, and step in a new direction. And he hopes that that will encourage them in the future. The other reason is just that Final Fantasy's been around for a long time. Everyone has their own idea. People think it has to be turn-based. Some people think it's about cutting-edge technology and better graphics. And nobody agrees. However, they just felt that turn-based just doesn't work with these style of graphics, or at least it doesn't meld very well, not as well as it could. So instead, instead of taking on what was what he claims is an impossible task, or a very difficult task at least, to develop a turn-based modern Final Fantasy game with these style of graphics, went with the combat system being real-time action for the sake of development. Now, on top of that, they do want to make sure that younger players, again, this is just trying to encourage people who have never played Final Fantasy to get in. Yeah, just there's nothing to really read there. It's the same statements we went over in the other interviews. And again, the game for fans and newcomers alike. So just they felt that real-time action was necessary to achieve that balance. So here's where something interesting gets said. This is whole new. I haven't seen this in any other interview, I don't think. As a major plot point, I can't really talk about how or why Clive can use the power of different icons. That said, I can tell you he does use the power of the icons as was shown in the trailer. You saw him swapping between different abilities. After claiming an icon's power, Clive will be able to unlock that icon's abilities in what we call an ability tree. And then Clive will earn points during regular battles and can use those points to further unlock abilities within that tree. So we have an idea of the actual progression systems that we're going to be having here. Every individual icon will have its own ability tree, and you will earn points and be able to customize that tree in a way that fits your combat style the best. Now that's what he goes into next. He wants every player to customize their character to their own playstyle, to use these points to purchase new abilities or power up abilities they are already using. They also want players to be able to decide on something that fits them really well and experiment. So rather than having those points be final, like if when you put them in you can't change them, you can change them. You can freely respec at any time and try something else in order to find what actually works best for you without having to start over or grind more. A good little bit of insight into the gameplay systems and the progression systems we're going to be expecting for Clive. We have picked up on some other details from the Dominance trailer and from some of the screenshots, such as the physical appearance of Clive changing depending on the type of equipment that he's wearing. So there are other little tidbits that we have seen as well. And then this goes into the icon versus icon battles. So this is something we've talked about a whole lot. So there isn't really too much to go over in all of this. He just kind of talks about the first time he ever thought about icons fighting and how it's kind of snowballed into what it would be like to actually play as an icon. And then that was something he was thinking about before he was even asked to make Final Fantasy 16. So now in Final Fantasy 16, while yes, you may have to contend with icons while you're in Clive's small human form, the ability to fight an icon as an icon was something he had always envisioned. And he's, just like many of the other interviews, compares it to a roller coaster ride. So with that, oh man, that is going to be a wrap for this round of interviews. About a 22-minute video. That's not too bad. It'll be a little longer with the outro here. Now, these are all the interviews at this point. These are all the interviews I've seen. I think there was one more I saw, but it really didn't have anything substantial. Like, wasn't even worth including in this video. But I've only seen one JP interview, and that's Famitsu. I don't know if Game Watch or 4Gamer or any of them have it. So if they do, we'll do another video. I'm sorry to be spamming your feed with this. I also have other things I want to work on too. But hey, we got a whole year. We got to milk it for what it's worth. Anyway, with that, be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And if you're just as excited for Final Fantasy 16 as I am, hit that subscribe button. Please hit that subscribe button and watch the other videos as well. Anyway, with that, enjoy, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.